Africa, a continent home to of over 1,000 languages and 54 countries. Commonly misconstrued as a place dependent on white intervention, Africa's pre-colonial history tends to be undermined in terms of how successful past civilizations have been. But what is it exactly that tells us about the successful and intriguing history of this vast continent? Modern-day archaeologists have shown us significant evidence that early African civilizations and empires were in fact not reliant on the stereotypical white European man, but instead proved to be independent and very capable of sustaining life. Archaeological evidence in itself is the main component that allows us to draw these conclusions while crediting specific civilizations for developing architecture, forming government, and giving rise to religions.
It is important to note human origins. During the early 19th century, scholars disagreed vigorously about different theories of human development. Some focused on the idea that human races developed from one specific shared descendant, while others looked at the opposing idea of polygenism, where we have no common ancestor and human races resulted from transmutation of species. The recent single origin of modern humans in the East Africa is predominant position held within the specific scientific community. There are different theories on whether there was a single exodus or several. However, it is important to note that archaeological evidence suggests African origins.
Early African civilizations were explored through archaeological findings, and eventually a widely systematic sense of trade, both internal and external, had developed. Across the many excavation sites of Africa, people have discovered elaborate forms of artwork and metallurgy, as well as hunting tools and other objects necessary for trade. Current evidence suggests that members of vast civilizations were more than capable of developing essential buildings, churches, mosques, or pyramids for religious and social purposes without the help of Europeans. Architecture was especially diverse. Some types were only unique to a certain kingdom or civilizations, as we have uncovered them over time. Artwork has elaborately implemented into the buildings of all types: mud brick, wood, stone, and so on.
Artwork and written language were clearly well developed for society to thrive as well as it did in ancient Africa. Given all these surrounding circumstances, let's explore how this evidence allows us to understand more specific civilizations. On the east coast of Africa, circa 2500 BC, the Kingdom of Kerma reached its peak of the North Sudan. Archaeology has shown that Kerma is one of the first cities in the world and that it is referred to commonly as the Biblical City. Its most relevant features that have been studied by archaeologists include the massive tomb structures known as the Lower or Western Defufa. While exploring the sites, archaeologists have found that there were specific burial procedures and that their archaeological techniques were very related to that of the Egyptians. Many of the buildings studied by architects show the placing of stones around the tomb structure, also reaffirming the idea that there was a systematic burial culture.
Archaeological evidence suggests a heavy reliance on biblical culture. The story of Moses is contemporary with Kerma and puts into perspective the dominance that Kerma had over the rest of North and the Eastern Sudan. Many of these biblical references were discovered on specific forms of architecture in the area. Temples and palaces represented some of the largest architectural projects in Africa at the time, in the entire world for that matter. The cemetery and burial findings are evidence of wealth and power in the kingdom. Tying into these biblical relations, the Book of Jasher describes the architectural formations conducted by Balaam and his rebels in strengthening the fortification system of Cush. These systems of forts served as protection from invaders, as well as a second passage for evacuation.
To further exemplify the presence of Christianity in the area, provided here are a few images of the religious figures and architecture that we have discovered and give us reason to believe that architecture tells us how significantly developed Kerma had been. Over on the west coast of Africa, in modern-day Nigeria, in existence had been one of the oldest and most developed states along the West African coast, the Kingdom of Benin. Since its creation sometime before the year 1000 CE, the Kingdom of Benin had seen splits in its social structure and political affiliations. But it is most important to consider the elaborate artwork developed in its prime. Being as it was mainly produced for the Oba's court, the people of Benin made art from cast bronze and carved ivory, two of the more beautiful and expensive materials to create such inarticulate works of art.
The Oba is referred to metaphorically as the leopard of the house, which is why these large jungle cats appear periodically in the archaeological findings of Benin art. The royal arts typically consist of brass, ivory, and coral, and were believed to possess sacred power. Archaeologists can hardly come to terms with the amount of time and skill that had been invested into the development of this finely crafted work. The Oba would utilize the art that was provided within his own order to support their own initiatives. In some cases, elaborate forms of art were the main deciding factor for determination of future events for the year. Evidence discovered suggests that these artworks were ceremonial and held very dear to the Benin Kingdom.
The brass casters were among the highest of ranks within the hierarchical structure of Benin society. The Oba would typically assign a master brass caster in the capital city and in another region of the kingdom. Once determined, these brass masters would go about precisely creating artwork to satisfy the Oba, which are clearly represented by these forms of arts provided. Artwork received so much attention from the Oba and produced so much reliance in the determination of future events that in some cases it led to expansion and conquering of other kingdoms in the area. This kingdom specifically provided archaeologists with a lot of material to interpret their history, and just goes to show how important understanding this archaeology is to developing history of these specific civilizations.
As shown here, conquer and expansion was the main component involved with the artwork that was provided for the Oba. Staying on the west coast of Africa, from 300 CE to roughly 1235 CE, we focus on the Ghana Empire, located in modern-day Mali. Ghana is typically known and studied by archaeologists due to its affiliation with gold. History has shown through the present that gold mines are in abundance in Ghana, and that the empire developed larger urban centers through their extensive gold, ivory, and salt trade. Archaeological evidence typically suggests that Ghana was very active with Europeans, but by no means whatsoever were they dependent on them for their development. The abundance of gold in the area actually had made the Europeans the ones that were dependent on Ghana markets, where Ghana was able to thrive in the trade market.
Tying into the abundance of gold was the findings and the idea that the king himself would adorn himself with necklaces, bracelets, and a high cap of pure gold. Power and wealth was all derived from gold. It was the focus of the trade, and the king had even decided that his riches were even worth selling to his people into slavery so that he may live a much more adorned lifestyle. Almost all buildings were made up of either slabs of stone with wet clay to make them stick together. Otherwise, houses were made of wet straw and sticks collected, and this was a factor that played into social structure. Overall, the concrete or stone buildings were made under the influences of one religion, Islam.
Ghana did not spend much of their time focusing on art, since it was not a main component of their culture. As mentioned earlier, the vast amount of time was spent collecting gold. For the most part, ancient Ghana developed small clay figures, as shown in these photographs. Islamic traders were obviously the main reason for Islam even having the chance to develop in Ghana. Institutions remained separate from the king's palaces. However, mosques and schools of Islam for reading were very abundant in the area, as they had been discovered by archaeologists. Again, they were very apparent and fully developed in Ghana, as shown here.
Okay, so as we have discussed today, scholars disagreed vigorously about different theories of human development. However, archaeologists have found through the use of fossils and other evidence that humans did very much originate in Africa, specifically East Africa. We have explored the findings of Kerma in the North Sudan for its religious affiliations and unique architecture. We explored archaeological findings of the kingdoms of Benin on the west coast, specifically their elaborate forms of artwork.
And finally, we had looked at what archaeologists had provided us with for Ghana, as they had shown us through evidence that gold was heavily influencing the rise of their kingdom. To leave you with this, just remember that archaeology is everything, especially when you look to see how significantly it impacts our understanding of pre-colonial African history. Thank you for listening in.
Good night, everyone.